Right. Okay. Labour markets then. I know from our maybe second chat, I don't know, I think it was like in June, that labour markets is something that we tend to move around the spec quite a lot. People teach it in very, very different places. Some people teach it at the end of year 12, kind of after exams in that period. Some people teach it right at the end of the course. Some people kind of integrate it in. So the first question that I'm asking is, when do you teach inequality and why does it work, and what's the difficulties with doing it that way? Crickets.
So I think for me, Isabel, sorry, I actually don't know how to put my hand up, so I'll learn that at some point. So I'm just jumping in.
Fine.
But yeah, what I was going to say on that, so I, like you say, I kind of do it at the end of year 12 micro. So I will normally do kind of year 12 micro, like supply, demand, elasticity, etc., market failure. I'll then do year 12 macro. And if I have time, it'll be like my first post-May, my first kind of part of the next year's micro. And I will do the labour market and inequality together as like one big topic, because I think they blend quite well together.
Yeah.
The reason I like to do it then is a couple of things. I think that when we're talking about things like a minimum wage, and I think it's useful for them to have some macro knowledge first, because then you can talk about, well, if we raise the income of people who have a high NPC, what's the impact on the economy? So I think it's helpful to have some sort of macro understanding before they look at labour markets. And similarly, when we want to talk about things like monopsony and market power, it helps if they've done at least a bit of information about market structures first.
Yeah.
I think for the labour market on there to fully make sense, I think it fits quite nicely after they've had a kind of broad understanding of like year 12 micro and then year 12 macro. So I think of it as a topic, it almost doesn't fit into micro or macro. It's almost a synoptic topic where, because you can look at labour productivity, or you can look at it actually in a micro market. You can look at the impact on LRAS, or you could look at the impact in individual industries. I think actually it's quite a nice synoptic topic to do at the end of year 12.
To kind of link everything together as well. I think one of the benefit of doing it straight after is actually of all the kind of later micro topics, it's really quite accessible, at least at the start. It doesn't start too hard, whereas I think sometimes with going into market structures first is quite a big step up, because suddenly it's, hey, here are some numbers and some charts and some graphs.
Yeah, and I think as well, it's so interesting. There's so much you can talk about. Like if you want to look at the gig economy or automation or like gender pay gap, there's so many things that people know intuitively, or it's just really interesting. Or I find that when I started teaching it, I suddenly realized that every week, if you just go on the BBC News website, there's some sort of story about the labour market somewhere. That I think it's so easy to find kind of real world application on it.
Jackie?
I was just going to say, in fact, I've just been teaching it this last week. It's always one of our last topics. So, I teach a tiny bit of it, enough to get the economic vote and sort of the minimal you need for AS, and then just teach as a big, I literally follow the spec actually. So we do all of labour markets and trade unions and minimum wage and stuff. And then in fact, I've just been doing this at the basics of it. And then in fact, the last couple of I teach the basics, and then when we get to government policies, then we pull it all together, and they were doing like a Google Docs in breakout rooms, doing it all together. And I just love it, because you're pulling all the micro stuff and the A2 micro stuff, and then macro where it's applicable. And they we've just done it, so it's sort of right at the end. And I always say, when we do the final sort of monopsony diagram, we all have a clap, and that's like the final main diagram of the course.
Like that.
And then we go and I pick up then also like privatisation, other some little topics, but that's our last big topic. And I always, and then they always tend to do that in the exams if it comes up, because I always sort of say, you've got labour markets, you've got income distribution, you've got poverty, and it can go in the same answers can go in all sorts of different directions, can't they? So it's interesting that you're doing it year 12. Just literally just finishing it.
So do you teach monopsony in terms of markets before you teach labour markets?
No, I don't teach. No, because it's not on the monopsony's not on the spec, is it?
I think it depends which one you do.
Oh, so AQA, it's not on, as far as I don't think it's on the spec. But so no, I don't. No, I just teach it when we get to labour markets. I might have mentioned it, but I don't think so. So no, I do it all at A2 as part of just as labour markets.
Andrew?
Same as that really, but yeah, in terms of precedents and antecedents, I sort of see a bit like Yusuf was talking maybe, but in a completely different place. I suppose it's just like Jackie said, I've just about done that, poverty and inequality. And now for me, the big culmination of everything, of all of economics for me, is development. And so obviously the poverty and inequality bit sort of features in there quite heavily. So I've gone down the micro path since autumn term for year 13, theory of the firm stuff, labour markets, poverty and inequality. I'm sort of done with micro, and now boom, development, having brought the macro alongside.
Isn't it nice though with things like development and labour, when you see them writing an answer, you think, look at how much economics they know. It's like you get a little proud moment. So a bit of debate over teaching minimum wage, whether you teach it when you're teaching minimum wage in markets. It's not very much extra to say, hey, what's the price of labour wage? What's, the quantity of labour is whatever, and kind of using it in that context. Any pros or cons there to teaching it when you teach minimum and maximum prices?
To be honest, I've always found it works really, really well. I think it helps them understand that idea of excess supply as well, because and also it teaches them how to flip between, it's the first time when I go, you always think of yourself as the consumer, now you've kind of got to think of yourself as the firm. And I find they find that quite hard to do when you talk about labour markets. So by introducing it really, really early on, quite a lot of my students have jobs anyway, so they can actually see the impact themselves. And it's a nice, easy one to go, well, okay, so it technically causes this unemployment, but then let's have a quick look at some data and show actually what it causes is gig economies and underemployment and things like that. And it's one of those where I find it quite hard early on to criticise a theory other than, well, it's rationality, and then we criticise it with behavioural. And you can criticise that theory really, really easily as well. I found it really, literally do keep it to effectively an excess supply. I keep it as that very much living wage diagram. We have a chat. It takes us about 45 minutes start to finish. But when we come back to that, when we come back to doing labour markets, they're really confident with it then. They're already thinking themselves as the supplier and that kind of thing.
It's no longer this alien kind of new thing. And I think as well, the point you said about kind of surplus in a market, I think sometimes it's difficult for us for students to understand why there being a surplus is a real problem. It's our precious resources that are being wasted, that are not being used. Yeah. And I think that's much easier to see in the context of labour, when you think because you can feel that labour could be doing something else more easily than something like, I don't know, flowers going to die, or there being too many fidget spinners or something. I think it makes that point much better, and it kind of links it back to the underlying. What
I've also found with some of my perhaps brighter students over the years is that by doing it then, it helps my students sometimes struggle to understand at the beginning how markets clear, that whole thing about the functions of prices and how they work. And I think when you talk about it in terms of labour, they can understand that, well, okay, now that I've got a higher wage but somebody sat at home, actually what is going to happen? And that helps kind of that understanding as well a little bit. And it doesn't take very long. And I'm a huge believer in interleaving anyway. So
kind of mixing and matching. Sarah Jones. Sarah Morris. You've got your hand up, maybe. I don't know if you want to say anything.
Yes, hi, sorry. Just trying to pick my dinner at the same time. Can't multitask very well. You can hear me okay, yeah?
Absolutely, yeah.
You can't see me. Oh, no. No, you can see me. There you go. Okay, hi. Yeah, I think I agree with that about teaching it earlier. I've moved it at the minute, a bit like Yusuf was saying, so I kind of do year 12 micro and then the year 12 macro, and then I do labour markets at the start of it. Then I do all the A-level micro, then come back to do the kind of more difficult bits of labour markets at the end. But I find in the year 12 macro that when you come to do things like real wage unemployment, you're like, oh yeah, and labour markets, and by the way, I haven't said anything about this. And here's this diagram, and it doesn't sort of make any sense when that unemployment topic. So I'm thinking of putting a lesson, just maybe a lesson or two, back in like year 12 micro to begin with, just to set the scene for that. So yeah,
that's a really good point. That's a really good point. Jake, did you have something to say? Sorry, did you?
Yeah, it was kind of Sarah touched on it a bit as well. I was planning for the first time the policy objectives, getting to unemployment, realizing that list in the spec it includes stuff about underemployment, and then I was planning for that, and I kind of went down a bit of a hole, and I've now planned a lot for underemployment and for the gig economy and the debate about all of that. And I'm wondering, would you all advise to save that for when we get to labour markets, and just mention that underemployment is a thing during that first macro unit?
Thoughts? How much detail do you want to should Jake be going into on the gig economy? Is this in year 12? Yeah, for year 12s. Any thoughts?
I don't say a lot on that at that point. I do most of the labour markets in the year 13 really. So I think you can, as long as they've got the gist with the general idea of unemployment, I think you're okay.
So it can wait until year 13. Nicola, go on.
I actually haven't done it, but as you were saying it, I thought this is a really, really good way to get the kids into understanding it, because a lot of the jobs they have are low hours contracts or 0 hours contracts. They're very used to that kind of using social media to get work and pick up jobs here and there. They're much more flexible in their approach because of the generation to labour markets than we are, aren't they? They've got a very different view. And I actually think, as you were talking, I'm thinking actually my students would have a really good discussion about this. And so some data in there I think would be really, really useful. And also I'm just chuck the data in because they've got to be able to access it really, really quickly in the exam, haven't they? I actually thought that was really interesting and something I might well put in earlier than I do.
I think basically it can wait, and if you wait until the end of year 13, then it can wait, and then you can do it alongside the kind of more tricky topics. But equally, they have enough knowledge to interpret it, and they have enough knowledge to understand it in year 12. So it's just it's. I think it's much of a muchness. It's just where you'd rather it go, and kind of the timing you've got and stuff as well. I think that was it. Oh, I just had a thought actually, just because I've seen Sarah, about EAL, and actually whether a lot of the graphic organisers would be quite useful for EAL students, because there isn't a huge amount of writing, and it's literally this arrow. This is a lot more visually. There's less other writing going on for them to understand. I don't know whether that's maybe whether anyone's read anything about that, but. How are we doing for time? We're okay. Is there anything else that we want to? Oh, go on, Sarah.
Yeah, no, I've not read anything on that, but I think that probably would stand to reason, wouldn't it? That it does make sense that following things through in a graphical way, because that's how I teach my students how to write their paragraphs. So I would show them like this leads to this, leads to this. And actually, I think you don't sometimes need that much fluency in analysis. In fact, sometimes less is more, and being quite brutally efficient is quite a good thing. So yeah, so I think that's probably what I would use actually. Yeah,
I think it takes away the other language, but then obviously the counter argument to that is that then they don't see this leads to as a result, and they don't see that language as much. But I think it depends whether you want them to understand the concept or whether you want them to be able to write about it, and maybe you want to do one at one point and one at another point. I don't know. Sarah, I don't know if you know, but your mic's still on. Oh, yeah. I just didn't want you to be eating your dinner and then say something about how boring this meeting is or something.
No, it's still the children's TV programs you can hear in the background as I'm still cooking and all that. Yeah.
Does anyone have any resources that they use for this? Any good examples that they use? We've already kind of talked about gig economy, but anything particularly interesting that they like to do with labour markets as a topic? Or any advice that they'd have for someone teaching labour markets for the first time?
I do, just to make it a bit different and to include inequality. One thing which kind of got my kids talking a wee bit was we spoke about things like childcare and maternity pay in Scandinavia, and actually what impact that may have on helping particular women, but everyone re-enter the market quickly. And so what impact do these kind of social policies have on reducing the gender pay gap? If people feel they can quickly come back to work, and if sort of potentially misogynistic employers believe that women or mothers will return to work quickly because of childcare, what kind of impact does that have? Which I thought was quite an interesting discussion to have. Just to go through what thing can we actually do to reduce the gender pay gap, see what different countries do. The other one which I think is really interesting, I think it covers a lot on the labour market, is automation.
Yeah.
I think it covers quite a lot of topics. Like, on the one hand, obviously you can talk about things like structural unemployment and people having to retrain new skills, but also I think you can talk about geographical immobility. So like, what happens if it creates more jobs for like research scientists in London, but it's gonna affect more clerical staff in a different part of the country? What's the impact of that going to be? And then you can also talk about what role does government intervention play in terms of like upskilling or retraining workers have? And I suppose they kind of get away from a slightly Luddite view of automation. I think, well, no, actually, it can increase employment for some and not for others. I think it can be quite a nuanced debate about the kind of winners and losers from change in the labour market.
And it can also, it's also the dynamic efficiency stuff, and actually some of like comparative advantage stuff, and because the relative amounts of each one. There's lots of arms to it, aren't there? Any other topics any other examples that you use, activities that are good, or advice for new teachers, or something that students find particularly hard? Sarah?
I just wanted to kind of really support with what Yusuf was saying, actually, is this idea of we do a lot of work. We've got a very male cohort of students who take economics, but all taught by female staff. And so with the labour markets, we find it really interesting to really get them to start thinking about the idea of kind of discrimination in the labour market, the gender pay gap, but not just gender pay gap, thinking about sexuality and race and all those kind of things, and whether that's being treated fairly from a labour market perspective. And so we get them each to do kind of individual group projects and try and build up their knowledge through group projects and then bring it all together synoptically. So I teach a synoptic lesson every fortnight with them. And within that synoptic lesson, we then build in synoptic contextualization, and then look at things like the budget and what they're doing to try and get people back into the workplace, the idea of things like shared parental leave, and all that kind of stuff to try and build up not just labour markets, but then inequality, then social policies, demand policies, etc., etc.
Goes a long way. It goes a long way. Nicola, you've kind of given some quite different advice, but I think it's probably coming down to the same thing, is that, not to get too bogged down with, there's so much possibility with labour markets that you've got options.
Yeah, that's basically it. I find it really hard not to teach marginal revenue productivity of labour in far too much detail, really, because I really, really like it as a theory, and it's not even necessary in Edexcel.
Breakaway, isn't it? But not Edexcel, is that right? Yeah,
so which to me seems bizarre, but I think it's really easy because it's one of those where you can have some really good discussions in class and you can find some really great examples, and I really try very hard to kind of teach it as I've put, with the brutal efficiency with which I hit market structures. And to be honest, my students always do really well on market structures, so sometimes I think that absolute ruthlessness does work.
I think sometimes that might be because, well, from my experience with market structures, is that sometimes the quicker you go, they realise that it's all together, rather than thinking it's lots of individual points and then they get bogged down in the fact that, so I think it's that kind of looking at it on a small scale versus the kind of 3,000 foot view. But I think the main problem about labour markets is that it's so interesting, which I think is what Andrew just said, is that right? It doesn't need much deliberate enhancement because there's so much going on anyway. Any more points on labour markets before we move on?